Welcome back to another episode of the Daily Flip podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and today we're going to be flipping through one story and one story alone, and it is about the consistency between the presidencies about their policy on China and how it will be moving forward. We're just going to do one episode today. We're still going to end with the Daily Delight to leave you feeling positive and ready to take on the day, but we're trying something new. We will see how it works out. So, with that said, let's jump into the Daily Debate. So, the China issue is something that is consistent across both parties. Right now, there is a push in order to, if not alienate, at least try to limit China's power economically on the world stage. But is this the good way forward? Especially when it comes to some policies that are being proposed by Donald Trump this time that are much more protectionist in nature. Is this the way that we go about limiting China's power? Tell me what you think in the comment section down below. So, with that said, our first article, and only article, comes from the New York Times. The headline reads, Commerce Department is on the front lines of China policy, which has been true for quite some time. Whether it be Trump's first term or if it's been during Biden's term, the consistency on China policy is the only stable through line throughout both of these administrations. Maybe a few different adjacent issues, infrastructure, investment in America, but they would definitely go about them in different ways. The tariffs that Trump put in place, Biden decided to leave in place and actually increase them to actually bring in more strategic tariffs or restrictions, like I've mentioned before, about what different products, when it comes to semiconductor production, is actually allowed to be given to China from the U.S. and its allies. So there is no doubt that we are approaching a unipolar or a unichotomy. That's probably not the right way to put it. Rather than there being a dichotomy, there's just a agreement when it comes to the political class in Washington that China is a threat. And does that mean that we will have one stable piece of policy and it will be this foreign policy moving forward? I don't know. We may have party members on one side or the other that are more friendly to China. You may have people who are true free marketers who say, no, we can't use these economic levers as ways to hurt China and engage in a trade war versus an actual war with them. And I could see someone from my perspective who is very, very, very pro free trade in the truest sense of the word, in a open market mechanism, as a open market mechanism. I could see people coming from that angle, and they would probably be more on the Republican side of the aisle, or I could see the de-escalatory, more democratic approach coming from the left side of the aisle. So both sides could have an argument to be more friendly on China, but that's just not the way that we are headed. And the reason why is because, one, their values are so antithetical to ours that we don't want to allow them to promote their view of the world to other places. This is number one and foremost what we use as a justification when talking about China. Well, they're an authoritarian, and they even say it in their own party name, communist organization and country that is starting to export those sort of values and work with more authoritarian. And then again, let's be clear, the U.S. has also worked with authoritarian leaders. We're not going to stop working with authoritarian leaders. But rather than working with them and trying to change them and bring about better, whether it be democratic, republic values, or even Western values to their culture, whether it be through imports or direct policy, the Chinese are very willing to just allow these sort of practices to continue as long as they make a bottom dollar. It's very interesting to me that we over here in the West, we have our unfettered capitalism, and we very often argue about how that is not a good value. When it comes down to it, you do not want to put money first. And we kind of criticize our own economic system. And yet when other countries take it to an absolute maximum, which China is willing to do, they don't necessarily have to have their values spread around the world, that you have to agree with them on the form of government. But you do have to make sure that any deal that is involving them will benefit them. It's about the bottom dollar. It is pure power politics. It's funny that we criticize ourselves for it, but we don't criticize other places for it. And we even criticize the U.S. for trying to be antagonistic towards those places. So when we're really taking a large examination of where we are going policy-wise, we have to maybe hem in my opinion, and this isn't saying, well, the government has to hem this in. I'm saying as a society, maybe we have to hem in our criticisms of capitalism by understanding the values that underlie our society, that underlie that capitalist system. They are actually very beneficial. A capitalism that is hemmed in by a moral society, not necessarily a non-secular society, but a moral society, one that cares about more than just power, that cares more than just about money, is actually guided by principles and morals, obviously, otherwise I wouldn't add the word moral in the first part of it. Maybe that's what we should be willing to project and understand, that that's the main difference between us, not just the way that we use that power in our governance structure. So whether it be a democratic republic or authoritarian, I think that is actually a way to frame the argument that can bring more people along, because not everybody is sold on this quite yet. Just because the Commerce Department in both the Biden and Trump eras have been willing to play this game, the rest of the populace needs to be brought along. And you may be saying, Alex, brought along. Yes, we have been over this before. I am most definitely a China hawk, but I've gone on about this long enough. But I think showing the distinctions between the two nations and why it is necessary to at least evaluate whether or not we want to fight back against China. I think those are all important things in context that is needed before going into a article that, if you are a person who is hawkish, you're not going to mind. If you're a person that's a dove, you're going to immediately reject what they're telling you, rather than understanding the context behind it, or at least the argument that I laid out, and being willing to accept it a little bit more. So here's what we have from Ms. Raimondo. Quote, I am truthfully not terribly worried that the Trump administration will undo the great work we've done, Gina Raimondo, the Commerce Secretary, said in an interview. Number one, it's at its core national security, which I hope we can all agree on. But two, it is the direction that we are going in. So basically, she's saying this position, being more aggressive on China, limiting what we give them, whether it be materials or strategic advantage through having access to some of the technologies that we have access to. This is an unstoppable train, and we need to make sure that we are in front of it, not being pulled along by other nations that fear China, but we need to be leading the march. If we're going to push against a nation, you can't do it haphazardly. You have to be out leading the charge. You have to be the one taking the slings and the arrows, so everybody behind you can feel protected. And that's not exactly what she's saying, but that is the core of what she is getting at, whether she's explicitly saying it out loud or not. Quote, Miss Raimondo contended that much of the national security establishment remains stuck in a Cold War mindset. Intelligence on Russia, she said, is exquisite, but to reorient to a challenge from China, she said that military, intelligence, and economics must be more closely tied together. Honestly, I don't necessarily love that idea. I feel like we're putting too much power into the hands of government, especially on the economic side of things. When it comes to intelligence and military, the government, for the most part, and you could make arguments about private militias and private intelligence services, which would honestly be scary. But when it comes to those two things, they naturally fall underneath the purview of the government anyway, and can be hemmed in by an executive in theory. With economics, I get a little bit worried when we have these sort of conversations. But her overall point is well taken, and it is where we are going. We are going to a place where all three of these work in tandem. Because China is not only an economic threat, they are not only a military threat, and they are not only an intelligence threat. They are all three. They are currently the fastest growing nuclear arsenal. Now, let's be clear. We still have larger ones. Russia still has a larger one, but they are the fastest growing nuclear arsenal as far as I'm aware. India could be on that list, but I don't believe they're building up too much. Pakistan and them are kind of in a stalemate there. But the point being that this triad, the military, intelligence, and economics, it will be the cornerstone of taking on the China issue, so to speak, just like the USSR. And while I don't think that we need to have boots on the ground yet, I don't think we're there, and it will take a lot for me to say we need to invade China. I think that with all three of these, they can be an effective deterrent to make sure that we do not ever get there. And I agree with her that this is a Cold War mentality. Whether or not you liked America during the Cold War, you didn't like maybe you didn't like the propagandic nature, maybe you didn't like the overbearing government, maybe you didn't like the feeling of having to be paranoid, looking around sometimes, or the fact that there may be a nuclear strike incoming and you had to hide underneath your desk as a child. There's one thing you can't deny, which is having a common enemy was, for the most part, orienting at least. It at least gave us a compass. We were fighting for democracy. We were fighting against the USSR. We were fighting for American values. Without a common enemy, our culture has begun to fray. Our culture has become something that would be unrecognizable to the people of the 50s, the 60s. And I think you could honestly make that argument from the 50s to the 90s anyway. But most definitely, I would say it's even unrecognizable to someone that was in politics in the 80s. Maybe in the 90s you saw strands of it, especially with like the anti-establishment movement, but it has shifted so much that having a common enemy, especially one that poses an actual threat, not one, and when I say threat, I mean to our standing. That doesn't necessarily mean they pose a military threat, but not one that's a paper tiger, not one that is fake, but one that actually has some meat behind it. And we do have to rally behind our nation, our flag, and our values in order to defeat. I think that actually could be a good thing for bringing those disparate views, those disparate people who are on the fringes of our politics back in towards the central narrative is not the right word, the central values of American life. Once again, not saying that we need to build up a fake enemy in order to get there. But I've said this for a while, which is China can very well be the next outside enemy that allows us to get over a lot of baloney on the inside of our political system and actually reunite us and bring us to a place where we know where we're going, we know what we're fighting for, and we know what we're trying to protect. That doesn't mean that we have to build them up. That doesn't mean that we have to try to create a false enemy. But it's definitely something that we need to contend with. It is this idea of having an outside force that is an enemy, an outright enemy, an explicit enemy, rather than the talking points that China is an ally and we're working with them and they have views that are antithetical or they have goals that are antithetical to ours. Having an outright enemy, is that actually beneficial to our society or not? I'm saying the quiet part out loud. I'm pretty sure anybody that's watching this, and anybody that's in politics especially, anybody that's watching this is saying, oh, well, he's saying what the politicians are thinking. The politicians are definitely thinking that China can be a uniting force. Now, do they think in those terms? Maybe not. But I think on a subconscious level, they've at least acknowledged it, and I think we need to acknowledge it. That's not to say that we have to be dismissive of this idea of building up China because you do sit back and say, oh, well, no, they're just using it as a tool in order to get us riled up and to be united. But you do have to think about these sort of things. You have to think about the images we're crafting, the symbols that we use in order to strengthen the picture of our nation. And when going up against a strong economic power like China, let's be clear, a lot of the companies are propped up by their government in debt spending. I understand. I'm not naive. I'm not saying they're the strongest economy in the world, but they are a formidable threat, and we have to be united in order to take it on. And we have to make sure that the next generation is fighting for American values. And when you have a common enemy, that is easier to do. So everybody has to really think about how much they're willing to play into this narrative, especially as you get older and you start to raise kids, or at least you're around kids. Are you going to disillusion them of this and try to break them from the herd, try to make sure that the propaganda and the narrative is destroyed? Maybe that is your prerogative. Maybe you're a person who enforces the narrative. But we all have to really think about this as we move into a time that is very similar to a Cold War. Or are you going to be the people out there protesting against the government's actions? Or are you going to be out there supporting them? Or are you going to be tacitly supporting them at home or tacitly rebelling against them? I think we are at that time where the uniparty is at least going to agree on this enough that they're able to really prop them up and use successful efforts, whether it be propaganda, media, legislation in order to pit us against them. So we got to think about it as a populace. Are we going to tacitly go along? Are we going to go along while knowing everything? Vice versa, so on and so forth. We're at a moment. We have surpassed the unipolar moment. We are no longer there. And to be honest and frank, we are declining as a country. We still may be growing in GDP. Our education levels are dropping. There are plenty of statistics that you can use, but you just need to look at the ebb and flow of history and of empires and of nations. And we are in the later stages where we start to be more protectionist. We're trying to lock everybody else out from our gains. We're trying to, instead of expand the pie overall, we're just trying to cut up the pie within our own country. So we're going to have to start thinking about these things. And one thing that can get us past that, one thing that can get us past the division, the infighting in order to get the scraps left over rather than, like I said, growing the pie, would be an outside enemy. But it has to be done right, because then we could be running into Thucydides' trap, excuse me. But I feel like this has gone on longer than I wanted it to. I wanted this to be a brief 10 minutes, and I've hit you with a lot that wasn't exactly laid out and structured perfectly. So if you have questions, throw them in the comments section. Maybe I can expand on any of these thoughts. But with all that serious stuff out of the way, we're going to jump to our daily delight. This one comes from Parade Pets. Precious Gray Kitten, who says hi every time mom talks to her in the cuteness chatterbug, excuse me. And yes, this every time they even have like a picture of the cat waving, which is absolutely adorable. If you want to be brightened up, the video is embedded on their website, or you can pull it up on the mobile version as well, and you can watch it there. It's absolutely adorable. And if you want to check out that article or the other article from today, the New York Times one, both will be linked in the description. And with that said, if you want to check out the Twitter tirade that comes out on Tuesday and Thursday over at the Twitter handle at Your Daily Flip. And if you want to listen to international news, that comes out on Tuesday and Thursday here on the YouTube channel and the RSS feed. So with all that said, there's only one more thing to say. Stay safe, don't die.